This is Siofra Bradigan, and this is Siofra's Magic Alcove. So, today I would like to do a follow-up on last week's video, Reclaiming Your Power, with some of the practical applications and steps and that kind of thing that I've taken to recover from the abuse that I suffered as a child and as a young adult. Um, so, first off, remember that the things that happened to you, if you were the victim of abuse, happened over a long period of time and are damaging in ways that's often difficult for us to understand or even express. So, magic or ritual, using them as assistance and tools in your recovery process, it's not an instantaneous thing. It's not like one and done, because you have layers and layers and layers of stuff that has collected. I know the I think in the incest survivors group, the first visualization kind of thing that we did had to do with sort of a check-in. Um, and I'm good at guided meditation journeys and things like that, so not everyone's going to get the same kind of thing, but I was looking and seeing what I had to work with, and my subconscious showed me a swimming pool full of dung, and I had a bucket in my hand that had some jewels in it. And I understood this immediately to mean that mostly everything that had happened to me was in that swimming pool. I mean, that was all the bad and terrible stuff. But even with all that, I had some gems that I managed to save and keep. So I had something to work with. And Starhawk talks a lot in her books about composting and taking these things, and just because it's negative and a horrific experience doesn't mean that you cannot then utilize the energy from that when you're transforming things to make something different out of it, just like you would with your garden. You put cow manure on your garden, or dead fish bodies or whatever. The earth is really good a good example for us to follow, to see um, how it it never stagnates. The nature doesn't stay still. It's constantly in motion. It's moving from one state to another all the time. And that is an example to us to know that we can do the same thing with ourselves. So, one of the things, I don't know why I'm suddenly getting scratchy throat. It's because I've been sneezing a lot today. Anyway, sorry. One of the things to look at are first to figure out what your assumptions are about how the world works. Because when we're going through that kind of a trauma, it would seem that that's the way the world is, because that's our experience of it. And so it's not like there's something wrong with you that you think things are bad. It's because things have been bad that you think that's how the world works, because that's what we experience it for. It's like it's giving us feedback. So when you make the decision that you want to change that dynamic, think about my swimming pool and my bucket. It's like, so there's a lot of stuff I have to go through to get through in order to get all that stuff out of that swimming pool, and to be left with maybe a few extra jewels that I can stick in my bucket. I don't know. But if you it sometimes feels, when you're starting the process, like you're trying to empty a lake with a slotted spoon. It's like, you're pulling up this stuff and you're throwing it out, and it just leaks right back in, and it seems like pointless, impossible. And I know all those feelings because I definitely have had them. And, growing up in a highly dysfunctional environment, um, I had no role models to look to. Finding a role model is a good thing. That's one of the things that can help because it can give you like something to reach toward. Uh, Certainly, there was no example of a healthy relationship anywhere in my life. My mother did not know how to protect us. My father was a sadist and alcoholic, not a good person. Everything was a secret, all those dynamics that were there. And so I couldn't even imagine what a healthy relationship might be or if there was such a thing. And it sort of felt like I was in a deep, dark hole without a shovel. And somehow I had to figure out how I could get from the bottom of this hole and build some kind of a method, a stairwell or whatever, without the shovel to get my way up into the light and out of the hole. And so certainly um, that was a very intense time for me and for people who knew me. I mean, it took years. It wasn't instantaneous. I think the first time I went into therapy really was when I lived in the Kispiox. So see, I moved there in around 80, 79 or 80, and so probably 82 or 83 maybe was when I went into therapy with a counselor. And definitely this is an important step to start the processing of all of that. And it started opening things up for me. But even before I went into therapy, I've talked about the experience I had with the tree in my backyard when I lived in Regina, Saskatchewan. That was after I left my second husband. And that was a very powerful, important, magical experience that seemed to come from nowhere. Because when I was young, I cried myself to sleep every night. I felt the universe must hate me, that there must be something so wrong with me, that these terrible things happened to me, that I wasn't sure what was wrong. Why was I so wrong, so bad that these things would happen? And I was leaving my second husband, and I was like feeling that again. I was very depressed and just hopeless and crying really hard. I call that kind of crying soul cry. It's like it's not just your body, it's your spirit, your heart, and everything that you are feels broken and helpless and hopeless. And I was sitting on my back porch in this state when I suddenly felt a warmth and a caring wrap itself around me. And it was so completely different than how I felt. I couldn't ignore it. It stopped me from crying in the instant because I was like, what is this? How is this? And when I was trying to figure out what it was, I'm talking in my head, like, where is this coming from? And I see the tree in our backyard, and I suddenly know it's the tree, that this other life form has reached out and wrapped itself around me to try and comfort me. And that was probably one of the most important things I think that's ever happened to me in my life. That moment, that recognition of something other than myself and other than people, which helped to give me some kind of a grounding in an idea of that what people thought about me truly wasn't important because they did not know what they were talking about. And that whether I had any kind of love or or connection with humans, I did with that tree. And it was just sort of beyond anything I could have imagined on my own. So I know it was real because of how it shifted my energy completely. I heard myself talking in my head, and was talking to the tree, and thanking the tree for this incredible gift of comfort, and then thinking that I was going crazy because I was talking to a tree. And I had one of those moments of clarity again with a voice in my head that says, no, you're just becoming sane for the very first time. And I think that is true. That was that kind of instantaneous shift that began me on the path of healing from all the things that had been done to me and that had happened to me, and that I in turn had done to others because of where I was at. So it's one of the reasons why ritual and connection with energy outside of ourselves is vital. Whether you believe in a god, a goddess, or nature spirits, or the planet, or just the idea of nature itself, but something like the larger universe that we're a part of, and it will respond to us when we're trying to change, and it will try and help us as much as we can. But remember that with all the stuff that's there, it's like you've created this relationship with the universe up until this point that's based on wrong information. And like Ian says, you cannot make a good decision based on wrong information. If you don't have good information, there's no way to make a good decision. So you can use that to forgive yourself for not understanding or not knowing and not being healed soon enough, or whatever the things that go through our minds. And when it comes to this subject, we are crazy in our own heads when it comes to that kind of stuff. But it's like, and don't judge your child self based on your current understanding of things. Like when I talked in the last video about me as I aged and understanding more what was happening when I was younger and what it meant, and starting to feel guilty somehow about that, because now I knew what it was. I didn't know what it was in the past. So we need to learn how to let that go. So figuring out what your assumptions are about how the universe works is important, because you cannot test those assumptions if you don't know that they exist. And we've talked about that in shadow work, because that's part of the shadow work too, is to know what it is that your subconscious thinks about what's happening, and what are the things that are trying to stop you from getting where you want to go, and why, etc. So that's why therapy is important. Hold on a second. I'm going to pause. So one of the things you need to do when you figure out what those assumptions are is to figure out how to challenge those assumptions so that you can rewrite how you interact with the universe. So if every time you say hello to somebody, something bad happens, you don't want to say hello to them anymore, right? I mean, it would sort of be an aversion therapy kind of thing. And so figuring that out is challenging, and it's an extremely emotional time when you're starting out, because all of the things, all the feelings that you have had are buried alive. They're still as intense as they were the moment they happened to you. And generally, you won't start going through some of these processes until you're in an environment where you feel somewhat safe, which is interesting for people who live around you. When I first went into therapy in Santa Cruz, it opened up the waterworks, and it was like I'd be sitting at the table with a bowl of cereal, and I'd suddenly find myself overwhelmed with tears, and I'd be crying literally into my milk and yelling at myself in my head for crying over my cereal and what was wrong with me. And having to accept that They need to come out. The feelings need to come out. You need to find safe places in which to allow it. And I was in a house full of people. Um, my housemates weren't sure exactly how to take a lot of it. And, me trying to figure out what was going on was kind of confusing, I think, for everybody. Since I wasn't as good an advocate for myself when I was going through that, because I was still very confused about what was happening and who I was and why I was feeling this way and everything else. But it worked out pretty well. I allowed myself to cry when I needed to. Um, I did the work that they asked us to do in the incest survivors group. And it was sort of ironic when I joined that group. I thought that my uncle, who molested me when I was like 6, uh, gave me the credentials to be able to be in the group, because although my father was my main abuser, uh, I didn't have any. I didn't have as many overt acts that, you know. I was looking at definitions. He's like, "Am I an incest survivor? What does that mean?" And it doesn't have to mean that you were actually related to the person. It means it was a trusted adult in your household or friend of the family, I think. And of course, by the end of the 10-week course that I was in, sessions, I was pretty clear that I was there because of my father, not because of my uncle. He just sort of got me in the door. Yeah, it's kind of weird. So, um, figuring out what it is that you need and what kind of support you need helps other people, because they don't know. They don't understand. If they haven't been through it themselves, they don't know. And if they have been through it themselves, they may not want to have anything to do with you, because your situation and what you're going through might trigger their own unresolved abuse. And I had that happen to me in a physical therapy office, where, yeah, and that was one of the things that taught me to be a little bit more of an advocate for myself. But I was seriously hurt by a physical therapist, and I kept telling her to stop, and she wouldn't, because she didn't think that it was a good idea to stop, because she had it in her head what needed to happen. And even though I had done my due diligence and filled out their paperwork beforehand and told them that I was a torture survivor, apparently no one read my paperwork. And that's something you can expect from people. It's like, just because you put it down on a piece of paper doesn't mean anybody actually looked at that piece of paper, and if they did, they may not understand what that means. And I'm still learning better ways to communicate that when I'm in a medical setting, especially. But when she did that to me, it threw me back into my childhood pretty severely, and all memories and things started coming, and I was crying, and knowing I have to let that happen, I let it out, because that's the thing, is like, you can get through it. It doesn't feel like it the first few times it happens. It feels like there's an endless supply of this stuff and it's never going to end. But each time you do it and get through it to the other side, you have more confidence the next time it happens that there will be an end, because nature is constantly changing. And that includes our internal, I don't know, relationship with the universe and ourselves and our emotions and everything else. Things are always in flux, and they never stay the same. They can't stagnate into one state. It's like something has to happen. So I think she had been abused, and she shut down. She actually, when I told her that I was a torture survivor in the middle of her torturing me, she threw her hands up in the air and took a few steps back and says, "If I'd known that, I would have treated you differently." And I thought, what? I thought no meant no. If we say stop, it means stop. I mean, aren't we being taught this? Apparently not in certain circumstances. Um, and then she left the room. She says, "I can't take this anymore." And she walked out and left me there as a complete and total puddle of intense emotion. Um, and then no one came back. I was there by myself crying, trying to figure out what to do. It's like, here I am, I'm in a medical office. There's no one coming to check in on me and see if I need any help. I decide, I guess this means I need to leave, so I pick myself up and walk out the door. I stand in front of the receptionist's desk, and she turns like this, and she looks down and away and will not make eye contact with me and will not speak to me as I'm standing there crying. And then I walk out and realize I've left my purse, and I have to go all the way back through the physical therapy department, all the way back to the room I was in to get my purse to get to my car so I could drive home, which was dangerous, probably, but I didn't have someone to give me a ride. It's not a good idea to drive when you're crying. It is not easy. But I made it home, and I got in bed, and or I wanted to get in bed. I walked into my house, and this was the day that they overfilled our propane heater in the back, and the house was filled with gas just before Thanksgiving. So I'm not in a good state, but I somehow managed to realize I should not pick up the phone on the cradle because the spark could blow up my house. And so I opened the doors and the windows. I had taken off my coat, but I was afraid to go back farther into the house to get it. So I went outside without a coat, and I stood in the middle of the street trying to figure out what to do, looking around. And a woman across the street was leaving her house, so I walked up to her and told her that my house was filled with gas and I needed to call 911. And so she gave me her phone, and we agreed I would put it in her mailbox when I was done. So I called the fire department, and they came over and they lit the pilot light, and so I was able to go back in the house and shut the windows and the doors and crawl into bed and turn on my heating pad or heating blanket and just cry. And Ian came home to find me this way from my physical therapy appointment. He wasn't very happy with them, as you can imagine. But he did the perfect thing. And this is something you can tell if you have a partner. You can tell them that when you're in this state, you don't want someone to explain it to you, to tell you what's wrong with you, to tell you how to fix it. You want someone to be with you, to hear you, and be present in where you're at and accept it for what it is. And that was Ian. He was fantastic. He just climbed on the bed and put his arms around me and just held me. He was pretty mad at the physical therapy department. And then after that, I had my first ever agoraphobia attack. I don't know what to call it. I couldn't get out of my house to go to my next appointment. Well, actually, I made it to the next appointment. It was that one. After that, I couldn't go back. At the next appointment, they gave me someone different. They still didn't address the issue. I told her that I was a torture survivor because I decided nobody was telling anybody anything, and I was right. So she, said, well, I need to do this. And I'm like, I can move in on my own. You tell me what to do. If I hurt myself, that's one thing. If you hurt me, that's something different. And so I did. And then after that, going back in, my body rebelled and says, you're not getting out of this house. And I called them up on the phone and I says, I can't come back until we sit down and talk about this. So I went back. They said, that's really too bad because we were going to give you to someone else. And then, so we made another appointment, and I knew that they'd given me to someone else and that we were going to talk about it. Turns out they gave me to a physical therapy assistant who was also an abuse survivor. And she was great. It was, it was a good thing. This is when I had a frozen shoulder, which is a very uncomfortable and unpleasant and painful experience. So, that's part of learning how to advocate for yourself. And even now, like when I went in for my foot surgery, and I'm used to like just telling them when I go in, I'm a torture survivor. And the woman says, what does that mean? And I'm like, what do you mean what that means? It means I was tortured and I survived. I mean, I'm going, oh, what does that mean to you? I said, that means you need to make sure you tell me what you're going to do before you do it so that I'm not surprised. Okay. So figuring out how to talk to other people about your needs, again, frustrating that you have to figure it out on your own, but that's what you have to do because if they haven't gone through it themselves, they have no clue. They can't comprehend and understand the intensity of what you're allowing someone else to do by letting them have control of your body in a medical scenario. It's like really intense, can be. And so the better you can allow yourself to communicate your needs, the easier it will be for the people that are around you to support you the way you need to be supported. And also in this process, you need to know what it is that you're responsible for, because what's yours and what's theirs. It's like a projection is huge for everyone, not just people who've survived this kind of encounter. Most people project on automatically on other people, and they look for reflections of themselves and make judgments based on those reflections. But so if you're going to learn to trust, you need to learn who you are and allow them to be outside of you, not extensions of you. And if you're an empath on top of it, that makes things even a little more complex. So the rituals I talked about on the last video. I talked briefly about the transformation, the cup transformation ritual, and that one was a very important ritual that I did, and I did that probably every day. And I watched the video so you can go through the whole step process of what it's like. Okay, let's get some water with me. I am phlegmy today. But it's a way of taking responsibility for your internal weather, the stuff that's inside of you that causes you to have confusion or conflict or rage or whatever, and acknowledging it, and then choosing what you want to be, what you want to use it for, because it's just energy. So choosing it and naming it, I find that very powerful. I do these things out loud. People do them sometimes just to themselves, but for me, spoken word, when we were talking on our live show about the Kabbalah and the sacred languages and the naming tree and all this other stuff, the spoken word has power in its own right. If you say something clearly enough, with enough conviction or understanding, you can literally change the world around you. It may not be the entire planet, but it can be your reality that you can shift by what you say and the words that come out. So saying them out loud helps my subconscious to hear the message more, while I'm also doing the symbolism of putting the feeling that's bothering me into the cup and transforming it to something that I can use. And like I said, these things don't happen overnight. It's a process. So, things will get better for a while. You'll think, hey, this is it. I've done it. I've healed. I'm completely well. And then it can go on for months, for years even, and then something will happen, and then bam, there's more of it. It's worked its way up through all those layers, and it's now back to the surface. Time to let go. One of the other things I did, I had a lot of rage. Rage at the universe, rage at people. I mean, I yelled at the universe a lot. Why are you doing this to me? I wasn't very happy with them. They just sort of stood there and took it, because after all, they have nowhere to go. They're like, man, she's really mad. But I would use one of the other things in Starhawk's book was a black stone, and stick the stone on my forehead and just scream. It helped that I lived in the middle of the woods during this part, I can tell you. I'm not sure exactly how you would do that if you had neighbors. Go out somewhere away from people to do that, because they might call the cops thinking someone's trying to kill you, which would probably not be good for anybody. But I would really focus on that feeling yell out loud why I was mad or what I was mad about and put it in the stone. And when I would feel tired, exhausted, depleted, something along those lines, then I would take the stone and throw it in the river. I lived by a river at that point. And you can bury it, but Starhawk recommends, if you're doing that particular exercise, not to bury the stone at the base of a plant because the energy is kind of strong and concentrated and it could harm the plant. It's not going to harm the planet in general, but you could, like, localized destruction of the plant, taking all that energy at once. So not a good thing to do for that. But if you're going to bury it somewhere where there's not a lot of plants, you know. Yeah. There was another exercise that I did that was in her book, and that was the learning to accept your body for where you're at, no matter your shape, your size, and just and that one is in front of a mirror with a cup of water on the floor between your feet or in front of you on the floor. And then it's a matter of gazing at your body until you can just see it for what it is without judging it for being too skinny, too fat, too flabby, whatever, too wrinkly, I don't care. Whatever it happens to be. Since I haven't done it in such a long time, I have to look up and see exactly what you do with the water afterwards. I think you might just pour that water out, but I'll have to check that and look in her book. But, you know, find things like that you can do. Then I did a lot of working with my inner child rituals. When I was in Santa Cruz, I started doing, on the new moon or the dark of the moon, I would do a ritual to get rid of leftover stuff that was still inside of me from the abuse. I think it was on those times I did a lot of burning of pictures of my father and my uncle, not to harm them, but just to eliminate their energy from me. And during that time, I was in two covens. One was a mixed group that I was in charge of. The other was an all-women's coven. And that particular coven, there was about 3 or 4 really militant lesbian feminists, and they really wanted to do a bunch of rituals that I considered not okay, like trying to harm somebody who was their abuser. And while I understood how they felt about it, I didn't want to participate in doing a ritual to try and, like, you know, take them down or take them out or whatever, not physically, which is what they were after. So you have to, like, really pay attention to how you're using your energy and what's going on around you. I talk about the end of that group and stuff in my video on coven or solitary. Kind of interesting side story there. But and then on the full moon, I would do a lot of nurturing, talking to my inner child or my younger self. That's where Amanda came in handy. My teddy bear. She became a representative of my younger self, since I had a teddy bear ever since I could remember, until, you know, Andy got killed by my mother washing him and not replacing him like she was supposed to. And so it was a very powerful symbol for me. It doesn't matter what the symbol is. It's meaning, if it's meaningful to you. So you look at your own history and figure out what was something that you connected with when you were little, before terrible things happened to you or whatever, something that would help you get into that space where you could talk to your younger self and send that energy, healing energy, and promise to protect that inner you. And a lot of dream work happened around the same time. And I think dream work is pretty common. Well, I don't know if it's common or not, but when you're in therapy, for me, my dreams became quite amazing and vivid and important processing experiences, because dreams are the subconscious talking to you directly. And, the subconscious speaks in the language of symbols. It's not really trying to hide what it's saying, it's trying to be blunt. It's sort of like a blunt instrument. But anyway, so a lot of the things that happened in my dreams that were important, one in particular that was like a breakthrough, I thought, because I was really working on trying to connect with that younger self that felt abandoned, abused, not protected, unsafe, unsure. And in this dream, I was meeting all these different parts of myself, and I knew that's what I was doing. I knew that these were all different aspects of me, and I was working on getting each one of them with me so that we were going in the same direction. Because if you don't have all of you going in the same direction, then a part of you is going to be undermining everything you do, which is what I was trying to stop at that point. And so I had everybody but one, and that was a young child who was very, very angry and was very adamant that she did not trust me. She was not going to listen to anything I had to say. She did not believe me, and she was not going to cooperate. And so for most of the dream at that point was spent in a room with her and my other selves, with all of us, each part of me coming to her and committing to protecting her from now on. And by the end of the dream, she was on board. When I woke up from that dream, I knew I had succeeded in something stupendous. So I was extremely excited about that. And so, like the rituals that I did to protect and nurture my younger self finally worked. And I had this idea that since time doesn't exist, time is a construct. So your past, your present, and your future are all kind of happening at the same time, but we experience it in a linear way. But since time is just an illusion, there's no reason why I can't send energy back in time to my younger self to keep giving her hope, to hold on, to know that things will get better, even if all evidence is to the contrary. And I still do that. I will spend time focusing on that part of me that was back there going through all that stuff and sending me energy, which I believe when I was in it, I felt. So I'm kind of like closing that loop, I guess. And although you cannot change what happened to you, you can change how it affects you and affects your future and what you do with it, which is how that's how we can beat them. This is how we can win and make them lose, because the things they're trying to take away from us, it's unfair that we have to do it ourselves, but we have to, and that's what we have to do. So it's working with the goddess and dedicating myself to the goddess and doing a lot of singing in the full moon in the bathtub by candlelight, and going out and being in the hills outside and in the moon and so forth. The more I could make that kind of a connection with the divine feminine, the stronger I could feel, because my mother couldn't be the mother I needed and should have had. Like, everyone should have a loving mother. Clearly, my father couldn't be the father I needed either. But in order for me to sort of confront my mother about my childhood, I needed to have that strong connection to that feminine energy mother source that would always be there no matter what. And I could never lose that. So that helped a lot. That was tremendous. It gave me the courage I needed to confront my mother with what she hadn't done, to be able to get through that last little wall with her so we could just talk and be people. And that's one of the things a lot of times people who are around us will say, well, it happened such a long time ago, why aren't you over that by now? Because it's not true. It didn't happen a long time ago. It happened. And it's continuing to happen. Every time you see their face, every time you hear their voice, every time you smell them or feel their breath, every time someone else talks about them, every time you see a picture of them, these things are still alive. And so don't let someone push you into saying that you're healed when you're still working on it. And it's okay not to be completely healed. I mean, it's a process. You do your best. And so I think that meditation, ritual, connection with the universe, connection with other sources of intelligence that accept us for who we are is part of my road to recovery. No doubt about it. And not just recovery. I mean, I think that we're all those of us who've been abused, we're all victims. Those of us who didn't die from it are survivors, but being a survivor isn't enough. There's no reason you have to stay as just a survivor. You can become a warrior, which is what I think the third stage of this is. And hopefully that's where I'm at. I feel that. Who knows if I'm fooling myself or not, but, and like I said, I'm always having to be more and more aware of needing to take care of my own self, which I committed to do to my child, right? My inner child. That's me as an adult taking care of that part of me by telling people, no, that's not okay, you can't do that, or stop it. And when the thing happened with the physical therapist, my daughter, when I couldn't get out the house, my daughter told me that I needed to go back, even if it was going to be difficult, because then I would attach that emotion to my shoulder from then on. And I knew that that was true. I also knew she did not understand what she was asking me to do, to go back to that physical therapy office. But I did it, and that's what courage is. Doing something that scares you half to death because you know you need to do it, because it's the thing that needs to be done, no matter how you feel. So, yeah. And I took her words to heart and thought about it and says, yep, she's right. I need to do this. And so I did. But when I thought about it, it's like, this was a trigger. I don't have that many triggers left. And I thought, this trigger is somebody hurting me without my permission, which is, of course, a lot of the torture I went through as a kid. And I thought, this is a normal trigger. People are supposed to not like that. You're not supposed to like it when someone hurts you without your permission, period. And I'm not going to try and make myself get over that. And that's the thing. It's like certain things are not necessarily something you need to get over. Yeah, so I instituted my own personal 3-day rule when people push my buttons and or do something outrageous, so that I can think things through and respond rather than react. And it has succeeded extremely well for me. I mean, that has been a good tactic that's worked. I had my first husband that I told you about in the last video, the serial rapist. One day I got an email, this was a few years back now, from his son. He had 4 sons and a daughter. And so I get this random email, and this person says that he is my son's half sibling, and he would like to get a hold of him and, get to know his half brother. And I'm like, what? So I did some research and found out where the email came from, and that made sense. Found pictures of his other children, and I could see it was his kids for sure. Contacted my son and says, okay, I verified that this is legit. And how do you feel about this? Because, he wants to contact you. And my son says, well, if he thinks our father is great or he still has contact with him, I don't want to have anything to do with him. And I'm like, I raised a really smart young man. And so I contacted the kid and said, well, unless your father... At first I said, how did you find me and where is your father? And he tells me it was him who found me, even though I changed my name and everything else. And I'm like, well, that makes me feel comfortable. Not. And so then I wrote back and I says, well, until he's dead or you no longer have any contact with him, my son says he's not interested. And by the way, your father went to prison for rape when my son was 2 months old. A little truth, which was not appreciated. And it was interesting because that night I was going to bed and I'm getting ready to go to sleep, and all of a sudden I hear this voice talking in my head, saying things that he used to say to me. I will always be able to find you. There's nowhere you can hide. You can't get away from me, that kind of stuff. And recognized his voice in my head. And I thought, I don't care that you're mad at me. This is your problem. And threw it back at him. And then, of course, I heard from his wife and how he was upset and angry at the letter I sent his son. I'm like, well, if he didn't want the truth to come out, he might not have asked me in the first place. That was a mistake. And so, and she wrote me this long letter. It's like, oh, it's for the kids and how they really just want to get to know him. And if he doesn't want to talk about his father, then that's fine. I'm like, yeah, right. Like, that's going to happen. That's going to be the first question is, why don't you want to talk about our father? And then told me that she had married the same charismatic and wonderful man that I had. And she was glad she stayed with him because he became the wonderful father and husband she always knew he could be. And I thought, you are fooling yourself, but okay. And then said, it was with great regret that he let you leave with his son all those years ago. And I'm like, well, that's interesting, considering he was in prison for rape at the time that I left. Like he had any rights whatsoever, excuse me, and he let me go. So I have no power. I didn't leave on my own. That's not true either. And then he also stated that he felt responsible for turning me away from God. And that was also on him because, he had turned me into a witch, a godless woman. And I thought, really? So that also was you. I was born this way. So there. So I sort of took this whole thing apart. And it turns out, this is hysterically funny in my view, that he and his wife were at that time doing classes through the churches in Canada on how to forgive the unforgivable. And this is something that we have talked about. And it keeps coming up. It's like the idea that you need to forgive your abuser, especially if they're related to you. It's a crock. I answered this question on my profile for some random guy who was asking it just yesterday. And it's like, no, it isn't your responsibility to forgive the person who molested you or beat you or tortured you or berated and belittled you. That's their job. If they're going to be able to figure it out, they're going to be half the ones that have to do it. And that is just re-victimizing us. That's making it our responsibility to make the world an okay place for them to be in, and it shouldn't be. There should be no place on the planet that they feel comfortable. They should be squirming in their seats all over the country and all over every country and anywhere on earth. And when people find out what kind of a person they are and what they've done, nobody should want to help them or take care of them or do anything for them because they have lost the right. That's my opinion. If you want to forgive them, that's your choice. My sister, one of my sisters decided to go that route, And although I completely do not understand it and cannot comprehend it, and it makes no sense to me, I support her decision to do that because that's what she decided she needed to do in order to feel better. So, that way is just not for everybody. But, yeah, uh, so then I waited my 3 days before I answered back. And I sat down and I told her everything. I told her in the last video I told you about him telling me everything he'd ever done just before he went to prison. I told her everything he told me that he'd ever done. And I went through all of that, and I ended it with, and if he had gotten any of those women pregnant, do you think it would be appropriate to contact them? And I never heard from them again. And it's like, if you're going to have a boundary, you need to make it clear. Because if it isn't a clear boundary, they'll find a way around it. They'll push it, they'll nudge it, they'll try to pull it in a different direction, they'll try and get around it, they'll try to make themselves an exception. If it's a boundary, it needs to be a boundary. And I consider myself one of his victims. So I think I was right in what I said. I just hit them with a truth bomb. And I don't write those letters very often, but when I do, people squirm. It's like, here it is, this is what I see, this is how I'm feeling, and this is what you're not going to do anymore. So that's the other thing, is like, I wasn't allowed to have a boundary. I couldn't have a door closed. I couldn't lock a door. I remember hiding in a closet trying to change my clothes because I wasn't allowed to close the door when we were moving from Rhode Island to Virginia. We were in a hotel. Wasn't allowed to have privacy of any kind. Never knew when something was going to happen in the middle of the night. I mean, yeah. There was no stability and no certainty about anything. I did have an experience when I lived in the communal household in Santa Cruz, where one of my housemates was trying to shock my children because they were in someone else's room, and he started banging on the door really loud, and I was in the room next to it, and I flipped, because that was one of the things that my father did a lot, was banging on the doors, screaming and yelling. And but I had gone far enough in my treatment or therapy at that point that I knew this was my issue. That he wasn't doing it to try and scare me. It had nothing to do with me, and he didn't know what it had done to me. And I got out of that room, went down the stairs because he was already back in the kitchen, crying my heart out, and explaining to him, okay, here's what just happened, and this is why I'm crying, and I know you didn't do this on purpose, but you need to know that this is not okay. So that learning how to separate what they're doing to how you're feeling, and taking responsibility for your own reactions and responses is important. Because, that's our job. We need to do that to become individuated. And I think that that's really the point of everything, in that sense, is to become a true individual, to make actual real choices. This is one of the ways you can help yourself do that. So I'm trying to think if there's any other practical applications. I mean, I did a lot of sitting on the ground. There was a tree in a park outside of town that had been hit by lightning and was hollowed out in the middle, and it was like, we used to go up there and pass through the tree and turn the tree into like a veil. It's like we've got from the real world into the tree trunk, and then out the other side we're now in a magical reality, and walking up the hill in the moonlight and doing a ritual in the moonlight. It was awesome. And there were times when I would just go and sit inside that tree. I would just go up there and just sit in the tree and ground myself. And that's one of the reasons why the sacred tree meditation, along with the healing chant, I think is such a vital exercise, because it connects us to all of those streams and gives us that extra energy and support, really emotional support that we need to be able to heal and to go through this. So, yeah. So your creativity, uh, whatever you can think of or come up with that works for you, if this gives you ideas, if you find other things that work for you, you definitely want to do, the traditional therapy, but make sure you find a good therapist, because a bad therapist is worse than no therapist at all, because they can make you think you're crazy. But yeah, just and being kind to yourself. If you've been abused and battered, you haven't experienced the kindness that you deserve. And we all deserve to have someone care about us and take care of us at different times when we're feeling low or what have you. Um, it's not a sign of weakness to need help, and it's not a sign of weakness to cry. It's, yeah. Anyway, apparently once I get talking on this subject, I just keep on going. So I think I should stop now and give you all an air hug. And yeah. So hopefully this has given you some notions. And just remember, it takes time. Look at the little things that have changed and gotten better. Embrace them. And eventually you'll have a bucket full of poo and a swimming pool full of jewels. Which is what I declare I now have. All right. So, heartfelt thanks to all of you viewers. If you have anything you need to say or add, you can put it in the comments. You can send me an email to siofrasmagicalcove@gmail.com. You can friend me on Facebook, but I'm getting so many friends requests. If you're going to friend me on Facebook because of the channel, send me a note through the DM so that I have an idea of who you are, because the scammers have come out to play. So, blessed be everybody. This is Siofra Bradigan, and this has been Siofra's Magic Alcove.